being this unusual type of group which didn't have a lead singer, on the one hand, it made them difficult to comprehend within the music industry. But once you get over that barrier, it actually presents this huge marketing opportunity, because then you can have all four characters and all the fans could choose their favorites. And you have this whole product range, if you like.
Welcome to A History of Marketing. I'm Andrew Mittrack, and I'm posting this episode on June 18th, 2025, a date that marks the 83rd birthday of the one and only Sir Paul McCartney. And to celebrate, I'm sharing my conversation with Ian Leslie, the author of my favorite book that I've read this year, John and Paul, A Love Story in Songs. The book tells the story of the astonishing creative partnership at the heart of the most influential band in history. Now, you might be wondering, what does a book about the Beatles have to do with marketing history? Well, as the best-selling musical act of all time, the Beatles knew a lot about marketing. They deliberately crafted their image, from their hair to their suits to their boots. They mastered media, from public relations to film to television, and they engaged their fans in ways that were way ahead of their time. So this episode analyzes the marketing masterclass that was the Beatles, and Ian Leslie is the perfect guide. Not only is he a great biographer who's immersed himself in the world of the Beatles to write John and Paul, but he's also a marketing veteran who spent the first part of his career in advertising and brand strategy. So this episode is a lot of fun. Here's my conversation with Ian Leslie. Ian Leslie, welcome to A History of Marketing.
Hello, Andrew. Good to be here.
Great to have you. I loved reading your book, John and Paul. You told the story of the Beatles and of John and Paul in such a fresh way and an intimate way. I just devoured this book. I made my wife read it and she loved it. And we've had the joy of just talking about this book, revisiting the Beatles music together and listening to some of Paul's solo work. So
Wow.
It's been such a joy. And I just wanted to start by saying thanks for writing this book.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. Thank you very much.
So given your background in marketing and in business, when you were researching and writing this book, did you ever find yourself either consciously or unconsciously analyzing the Beatles through the lens of marketing and promotion and business strategy?
Yeah, I mean, there are several points where you reflect on how kind of certain decisions impacted on their success, or slowed it down in some way. And, apart from anything else, apart from the creative and the artistic story, which is obviously where I focus on in the book, it's an incredible story of innovation and creating a whole new market. We talk about inventing the future a lot. I mean, these guys really did invent their own future because they weren't satisfied by what was around them, and they become a big brand in their home market, and then they become a huge global brand, and they're absolutely dominant, and it turns out to be an enduring brand too. It's not just a couple of years. And they're kind of creating a new category or new categories as they go, both in terms of the overall category of being a pop group that isn't just a flash in the pan, and also products like the album, which hadn't really been best-selling product types until they came along. So yeah, it's an astonishing story just from a kind of commercial point of view.
Yeah. Well, let's talk through this story. I think for me, one of the first parts of the story of establishing the brand is actually just the selection of their name. The name The Beatles, I think, is just like the perfect band name. And it sounds so perfect. It almost seems like it was just kind of came from the heavens organically. But it was a really consequential decision and deliberate decision they made. And they tested a number of names prior to the Beatles. Of course, they were the Quarrymen to start. But do you have any thoughts on or reactions to their approach to naming and the name the Beatles itself?
That's interesting because it's interesting that you see it as the perfect name, and well, I'll invite you to expand on that in a minute,
Yeah.
because I could see it both ways. I mean, obviously it worked out pretty well, but you might say it's like the worst name ever as well. And it's almost like these two things are inextricable. That It's either going to be the worst or the best. It turned out to be the best. But let me just put the case for the worst name before we get onto the case for the best. Um, there were not any other. It was not a recognizable type of name, if you see what I mean. Basically, the stars of the time in the late 50s and early 60s were solo stars, or solo star plus backing group. So you had your Elvis Presleys, and you had your Cliff Richard and the Shadows,
Right.
right? So you had your X and the Y's, and the idea that you could just have the somethings, or Buddy Holly and the Crickets, but the idea of just the Crickets or the something, there wasn't really a thing, it wasn't really a precedent for that, and it got the Beatles into a lot of. It kind of slowed down their progress in a way because they were so determined not to have a front man for various reasons, that promoters and so on found it hard to kind of say, "Well, who are these? I don't understand. What is this group?" Um, and then the other thing is, it's just this really cheap pun. I mean, you know, the stories differ on the origin of it, but it's something to do with maybe they took inspiration from the crickets and they kind of chose another kind of insect, and but made a pun on it because they were playing what was called beat music at the time, and they end up with this pretty cheesy pun, and the name had to be explained over and over again.
Hmm.
And you see this all the way through, right up until they start becoming famous. All the promoters, all the record label guys, and audiences are like the beat, the what, the beat, what? And then you
Hmm.
have to spell it out. Yeah, it's spelled Beat. So it's this kind of laborious kind of thing where you have to explain it, and then once you get it, you're like, oh yeah, but it's the Beatles. I'm in on it. So I mean, and this I think is where we kind of flip into your best name ever case.
Right. Yeah. So I think the case for it being the best name is that I've had the chance as a marketer to name a couple of companies and products, and I think the what you look for is you want something to be short, right? It's aside from the it's a couple of syllables. It's easy to pronounce. It's unique and it's clever, but it's not like some weird misspelling. Beat, Beat. All right, it's kind of easy to spell. Also, I know it existed 40 years before Google and SEO, but like if I was to name a thing today, it seems very like SEO optimized, right? Which is kind of funny. And then also it enables them, they were the Quarrymen, which sounds like a very local,
Mm.
schoolboy kind of name, right? I think it alludes to the school they attended, I think, right?
Yeah.
And I couldn't see the Quarrymen having Quarrymen mania, right? And
Yeah.
Quarrymen merchandise kind of being a global phenomenon. It's a very like actually a hard name to spell. So the Beatles just seems to have a certain universality to it. They also feel like they're a group, which is really enabling their success. And it was really prescient of them to to not be Johnny and the Silver Beatles. And also it's more distinct. Something like the Animals. It's like yeah, it sounds a little vague though, right? It doesn't sound as unique and ownable in a way. So that's my bull case on the name, the Beatles.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the way I see it is names like this that are not that don't describe the product in some way, that are just sort of odd or weird and need explaining. They're like high risk bets. They can easily go wrong. Which is why a lot of, or maybe most brands, when they're naming their product, the brand managers, they choose a name which kind of explains a little bit what the product is.
Mhm.
So you say maybe this is like Microsoft versus Apple. I mean, Microsoft is actually a bit of a weird name because they were kind of weird guys, but at least it was something to do with microcomputers and software. I don't exactly know what the derivation is, but you kind of get the
Mhm.
general area. Whereas Apple, it's just like what? It's got nothing to do with computers. I don't even get it. But Apple, well, they're both successful, obviously, but Apple's probably the kind of the cooler, better brand name, and it paid off in spades, right? So yeah, the Beatles chose a name which isn't descriptive. It's not something and the somethings. It doesn't tell you anything about them really, except I suppose that it's beat music. It's an odd name, but once you're in on the secret, then you kind of feel like you're in on a club, and so it helps to generate this early community of fans and community, which a lot of startups kind of really look for when they're in the first year of existing. So I guess there's something in that.
Yeah. So they had this really distinct image in their early days: the mop top hair, the matching suits, the Beatles boots, literally iconic from head to toe, from their hair to their boots. And so would their manager Brian Epstein deserve a lot of credit to this, or do you think this was leaning into some of the Beatles' organic tastes of fashion? And what are your thoughts on kind of the initial image they created?
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of question. Before they meet Brian Epstein, they kind of had They always had a strong look. Like they always looked, and they looked very different from the other groups that were around. The other groups tended to wear flashier kind of gold lame kind of suits, and looked very much like they were kind of in show business. And the Beatles went for a kind of scruffy leather jacket. It looked like they were
Mhm.
just thrown together, but actually they all wore the same thing, and it was all definitely kind of part of their image as kind of scruffy upstarts. Now Epstein or Epstein, I'm never quite sure. I always pronounce it both ways. So
Right.
Epstein comes along and he's like, "Well, you're not going to really get on TV if you look like this, right? You have to kind of find some compromise here." And looking back on it, Lennon was like, "Oh, he made us sell out and so on." But I don't think that's quite right. They already looked a bit sort of try hard with their leather jacket rockabilly look. It looked a bit like they were trying to be throwbacks to the 1950s. It was something a bit kind of, we've done that now, guys. So I think they're already ready to move on. And the other thing is, they took his cue to smarten up, but then they chose really cool suits, like kind of Yves Saint Laurent influenced, collarless jackets and narrow trousers, in kind of cool materials. So they found this. It was a bit like a sort of Motown group, really. So they find this way of saying, okay, I understand the goal now. The goal is to break into kind of mainstream media in effect, and you can't do that if you're dressed for small clubs in Liverpool and Hamburg. But also, I don't want to just be like all the other groups. We've always hated being like all the other groups, right? We're never going to do that. So why don't we find our own way to smarten up? So that's the kind of interesting lesson there. Is like you're going to compromise with the audience or the market in some way, but that doesn't mean kind of becoming less individual. You just find a new way to be individual.
It also strikes me that their look and their image, and I kind of think of the Beatles as the black and white era Beatles and then the color era Beatles, and that there's sort of a Hard Day's Night and there's Help, right? And Help and Beyond, and that this image that was right, it was the 60s, but a lot of things felt like the 50s still, and that it somehow just seemed to look good on black and white television, just their silhouettes and their image, and it feels like they were really attuned to the actual media that was presenting them.
Yeah, and you can see that in the album covers as well from pretty early on with the Beatles and Beatles for Sale. And they are opting for a kind of moodier look. They don't want to be just kind of these grinning guys, or these like glamorous pop star image. They're doing something new, and it's a bit more European. It's influenced by Germany, by Astrid and by French culture. And more to the point, here what they're doing now is taking control of their brand, in
Mhm.
a way that other groups hadn't. And they start doing this from beginning to end of the supply chain, if you like, right?
Okay.
And if you think about the fact that Lennon and McCartney were writing their own songs and singing and performing and then recording them, that was pretty much a new model, certainly for a group. And they were effectively, because before that you had groups and then you had songwriters and like Tin Pan Alley songwriters, and the labels would distribute they would kind of match the songs to the group or to the solo act. And they say, okay, try this song, try this song, try this song. And all very quickly, the Beatles were like, we don't really want to do other people's songs. We'll cover rock and roll songs or soul songs that we love, but we're not going to accept other publishers, other writers' songs because we've got pretty good songwriters. So
Yeah.
so they vertically integrate the creation of the content and the distribution of of the content, if you like, and also the kind of front end of the content, not just in the recordings, but in the actual packaging of the product as well. So they take control of that creative process from beginning to end. They do that pretty quickly with it, really within the first year of getting famous. So it's an extraordinary amount of kind of very audacious act of confidence and a kind of land grab, which opens the way for this whole new category in effect.
Yeah, it's just astonishing the Yeah, the intuition they have, the boldness of it, and that they were able to get this control, and they were like, they're just little kids, like they're like what 20, 21, like in this era. And I think George is probably 20, and maybe John's 22 or 23 at that point. But it's like yeah, and they have such great intuition about so many things about not, of course, obviously the writing of the music and the performing of the music, which is at its core, but then also of their image and just the, as you said, the vertically integrated end-to-end ownership of so many things. They were just not only really good musicians, but also really good at a lot of other things.
Yeah, I mean, I still don't really understand where they got that confidence or that audacity from, but I think it is partly to do with just having been together and experienced so many amazing experiences, both traumatic and joyful and hard and fun together in those years as teenagers in Liverpool and then in Hamburg, that they felt, John and Paul in particular, but the whole group really felt kind of indestructible and had a sense of, well, you take us or you leave us. They weren't
Mhm.
absolutely against compromises. We've seen in the sense, in the terms of like how we dress and so on, but they did have this sense of themselves as artists. They might not use the word, but they did think of themselves as artists, rather than just entertainment stars who were going to do music for a year and then become game show hosts, which was the conventional career route for most pop stars.
So I want to talk about Beatlemania and the merchandise as well around this, because I was watching the Beatles 64 documentary. This is the one that was produced by Scorsese. I think it's streaming on Disney, and it struck me as that when they came to America in February of 64, their fans already had all the Beatles merchandise. Seemingly, they have this clip in the documentary of people having the mop top wigs and buttons and knockoff Beatle boots and all this merch that they had. And it's like, well, these people, they just came onto the scene. I think their music had probably been on the radio in the months preceding their visit, but still, it just seems like, just operationally, how did they get all this merchandise produced so quickly? I'm sure it was some mix of knockoffs and maybe some legit merchandise. But do you have any sense of sort of the merchandising machine that sort of surrounded the Beatles in this era?
I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not an expert on that side of things, but I think a lot of it was not official merchandise. I think their record label Capitol in America very quickly did a kind of big merchandise off effort when "I Wanna Hold Your Hand" becomes their first smash hit in America. And then they did kind of do the wigs and they kind of marketed them as these four mop tops and so on. But then I think, America being America, lots of small entrepreneurs just sort of pitched in and did their own thing. And the thing is that they hadn't tied down the kind of legal rights to that and the commercial rights to that merchandise. And it's one of the things that Brian Epstein gets criticized for most harshly in
True.
retrospect, is that he didn't kind of tie down merchandising deals and therefore kind of left an awful lot of money on the table. How far he was expected to kind of have foreseen that boom in merchandise, not totally sure, but it's true that they weren't making a lot of money from this stuff.
Yeah. They were handling a lot of things and going on uncharted territory on a lot of these things. So it's understandable that some merchandising rights in America might slip away from them.
Yeah.
The other thing is A Hard Day's Night. I don't know how it's also released in 1964 or how they had the time to film such a good movie, but they make this film A Hard Day's Night, which really stands up really well. And do they see films as sort of a way to promote their album sales and their concert tours, or did they see this film as sort of an art form in itself that they wanted to really break into, or what was their approach to where
Well,
filming fit in?
Well, it was I mean, I think it was fairly conventional at the time for pop stars, Elvis Presley most famously, to make movies, as an extension of the brand, yeah, as another way to distribute your content and another way to kind of meet your teenage fans. So that wasn't innovative, saying, "Oh, we're pop stars now, we need to do a movie." The innovative or the thing that was different about them was that they decided it would be good. You know, I can
Yeah.
we can put it more like, they wanted it to be innovative or artistic or creative, but basically they just like, we don't want to do a crap movie because we think all these teen pop movies are crap. And so I don't know exactly how they chose Richard Lester, the director or the writer. I can't remember his name, but the writer had spent time in Liverpool and was kind of part of the kind of beat scene. He kind of got them, and so they helped kind of choose him. But they end up with this team, including a cinematographer brilliant cinematographer. I can't remember his name now, but he went on to shoot Star Wars. So it's probably responsible for the two most powerful visual properties of the 20th century. So they had an amazing team, so some of that is kind of talent that was around in Britain at the time. Some of it is luck, but a lot of it is this Beatles kind of driving force, which is, if we're going to do this, we want it to be good. We don't want it to be mediocre and embarrassing. You can get a long way with that attitude.
There's a quote that you wrote in your book on A Hard Day's Night, or this era, and I'm gonna read it back to you because I like it a lot. So it says, after a hard day's night, the Beatles had distinct personas in the minds of the public. Vividly drawn but crude cartoons. Ringo was the doleful clown, George quiet but deep, John was the Beatle with the sharp tongue and scathing wit, Paul the cute and charming one. The Beatles conspired to create these masks, but by 1966, they were wary of them. And I just think this is an important passage because it sets up a lot. But the word that stood out to me is they conspired to create these masks. Why did they conspire to create masks? Could you unpack that line?
Well, they realized, together with Brian Epstein, that being this unusual type of group which didn't have a lead singer could actually be, on the one hand, it made them kind of difficult to comprehend, within the music industry. But once you get over that barrier, it actually presents this huge marketing opportunity, because then you can have like all four characters and all the fans could kind of like choose their favorites. And you have this kind of whole product range, if you like. They wouldn't have put it like that, right? But
Mhm.
certainly Epstein was central, even before they were famous, at the Cavern, saying, make sure we give George a turn at the microphone. I want you swapping between John Paul and George, and when they're on stage, you see Ringo kind of raised up. So Ringo's not
Mhm.
this anonymous drummer. He's very much part of the visual kind of presentation of the group. And so in that sense, it was a conscious presentation. And then when it comes to the film, obviously the film is this kind of heightened version of Beatlemania, kind of comedy, ironizing version of what's going on with them in that first year of fame. And it creates these kind of these caricatures which are rooted in some truth about what they're like, but are not the whole deal. So yeah, they're very much part of that creating that story. But obviously it's somewhat in tension with their mission as artists, and their desire to be, individual human beings, and not just kind of fodder for the entertainment industry.
It's useful to kind of have a shorthand or sort of the crude cartoon, but it does down the line as they evolve sort of put them into a box, or even kind of plant the seeds of music criticism about their solo careers, and how the legacy of John versus Paul as that kind of becomes a central point to your narrative.
Yeah, true.
One of the other things they do in this era that I wanted to highlight is that they have an official fan club, and they do these Christmas records, and they'd record these, they'd mail them to their fans, and they'd be sort of lower quality recordings, but they'd have improvised jokes. And it felt like a really, if you can listen to them. I think they've been packaged on the anthology and are on YouTube and such, but it feels very modern as far as a marketing tactic to like kind of have this special, raw, authentic, hear directly from them, hear their improvised jokes on the recording. Feels like it was almost recorded in a living room, or that they're having drinks or something like that or some other drugs as they're recording these, and then they just send sort of their authentic selves to their fans, almost like an early newsletter. Can you talk about this? Was this a common thing in the time, or is this something that the Beatles sort of helped pioneer or perfect?
Yeah, that's a great point, and a great sort of analogy for how fans communicate. Yeah, they were communicating very directly with fans, weren't they? I don't know is the answer. I don't think it was that conventional. I don't think they did it in a conventional way. And they were always very assiduous about looking after their core fans, I suppose, you know. All the way through, they were replying to a hell of a lot of letters, for instance, you know.
Yeah.
So many stories about people coming in and seeing them after gigs or before gigs, just going through piles of fan mail and writing replies, making Christmas recordings and sending it to their fans, you know. They were doing that all the way through, the '60s, even after the growing their hair and being cool and doing drugs and being weird, right? They were still doing Christmas messages. There's a very, like, I think, kind of amusing conversation in 1969 when they're all splitting up and they're grown-ups now, and it's all so different and changed, and John is saying, "Yeah, but what are we gonna do about the Christmas message? We need to get that to our fans." They're still thinking about that. So they did have, like, this intense kind of focus on the bond that they had with their kind of core audience. And comedy was a big part. Being funny was a big part of it, right? It's not just about music. It's about this personal connection, and they always had that as well as the music, and as well as the image. They always had this kind of strong personal bond with their fans that they were
Yeah.
very kind of keen to cultivate.
I want to, on their fans, what's really funny to think about also is just how their fans evolved over time. That in the Hard Day's Night era, in the Ed Sullivan era, what you see mostly on the screens are it's overwhelmingly teenage girls, right? And I imagine that a lot of their fan mail was from teenage girls. But then, and the older crowd, if you see them interviewed in this era, they think of them as a passing fad. But then pretty soon they'd have universal appeal. Abbey Road is only 6 years or so later, 6 7 years, 6 years later when they're recording it. And that doesn't seem like an album for teenage girls at that point. Same with Sergeant Pepper's. And they expanded their appeal, probably with that core teenage girl audience, but they didn't limit themselves to that. Can you speak to how did they think about sort of expanding their appeal and keeping their teenage girl fan base, but also expanding it so they weren't limited to that little box?
I don't know. I mean, I actually think they for all that we're talking about them being kind of intuitively great marketers, which I think they were, they didn't really strategize about their audience in that way, right? So they weren't ever thinking, "Oh, we need to move on to a different audience now, and how do we manage that transition?" They really were just thinking, "How can we delight everybody now?" And what's going to delight ourselves, and they turned out to be the same thing to a remarkable extent. Now, with the teenage girls, I mean, I think what's interesting about that is that it was the teenage girls who kind of caught on to how amazing this music was before the rest of the country, before all the, like, older blokes who later on kind of took ownership of this story and say, "You don't understand the music. It's all like, okay, well, you completely passed you by." And that the screaming was basically the most appropriate response to a change in music and culture, that was this seismic. So I applaud all those teenage girls. And the other thing to say about this is that the Beatles never took those teenage girls for granted, and they never talked down to them. They were never scornful about them. So they might have complained about the kind of noise at the concerts now and again, but you'll search high and low for interviews in which they make any kind of mean-spirited comment about their fans. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
I think particularly from John and Paul, and George, but so I don't think they ever kind of thought in terms of, "Oh, now we need to get rid of this kind of shallow, silly teenage girl audience, and move on to the kind of, like, mature me." I just think they thought, "We want everybody in. Well, this is a big tent. We want just as many people in it as possible."
That's right. Yeah, certainly not excluding that fan base, but expanding it. I think this is a quote that I highlighted from the book as well, and it goes, quote, "As well as female fans in Liverpool, McCartney's ballads later helped win over older generations, but the ballads were more than a marketing tactic." End of the quote. And I think that songs like "Yesterday," which is just this astounding piece that kind of stops you in your tracks, and it's not the whole band. It's Paul solo with some orchestration on the record, that doesn't necessarily feel like it's pandering to a certain audience, and that, or just to the teenage heartthrob audiences. Although he's the cute one and all that, but it also has this just appeal to a broader crowd than just the folks who are watching Ed Sullivan.
Yeah, absolutely. They always had this, like, incredibly broad appeal, and so in a way, they were kind of the voice of a young generation. They were subversive, they were anti-establishment, rebellious in some ways, but they were always kind of charming with it. There was an impossible to resist kind of charm about, you just rattle your jewelry, that was that remark from Lennon at the London Palladium was just the kind of perfect Beatles Lennon style remark where it's kind of satirizing the rich, but it's kind of like in quite a warm spirited way, it's not that mean. So yeah, they did have this remarkable appeal, and then they become really the brand leader for pop and rock music. And you think about brand leaders in any category. What I learned in my kind of marketing theory days, it's not always true, is that the brand leader can win on all the attributes in a category. It can lead on all the kind of key attributes that people care about when it comes to this product type, right?
Yeah.
And then the challenger brands have to kind of come in and kind of take one of them, compete on one of those dimensions, because it's only the brand leader can compete on all of them. So in we have a very famous brand of toilet paper in Britain called Andrex,
Okay.
and it was the brand leader for many years, and I'm not sure if it still is. And its slogan for many years was soft, strong, and very long. So there you have kind of all the three things that people care about in toilet paper, right? It's soft, it's strong, and there's lots of it. And you can have those and kind of brands when you're a brand leader.
Yeah.
But then if you're a challenger brand, you just want to come in and say, no, we're the softest, right? Might not be the strongest or the longest, but we're the softest. And that's
Right.
what you start to see in the 60s, because you see the Rolling Stones come in and consciously position themselves against the Beatles and say, well, we're not going to try and be for everyone. We're going to be the voice of the teenager versus the parent, right? The rebel versus the establishment, and we'll position ourselves against the brand leader and kind of, yeah. So they opened up this space for like different brands to kind of like come in and take different parts of the market.
There's a quote from Paul. I have it here. John would be getting an extension on his house or something, and the joke used to be, okay, let's ride a swimming pool. It was great motivation. And then in the next 3 hours, help appears from nowhere. And suddenly you get this idea, this is a hit, this is a good one. And you become aware that what we're doing is making money, making good money. And not that all of their songs were probably written just purely for money or that, but it was something that was in their mind, and that they were thinking about the appeal of their music and the marketability of their music as they put it together. So it does seem like it was something that was a conscious driver of their work somehow.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, they always wanted to be rich, and they
Yeah.
always wanted to be famous, right? Um, but I think that what that comment is so revealing of is how um, kind of our ideas of how to make money were kind of flipping around this time, and how kind of almost shocking it was that you could do this, right? Because if you're growing up in an era where, roughly speaking, the amount you earned was somewhat equivalent to the amount of work you put in, the amount of number of hours you put in. And certainly, there are alternative careers which were like working in a factory, or maybe becoming a teacher if you're lucky. That you worked really hard and then you got a salary for it. The idea that you could just spend half an hour writing a song and then 100 times a teacher's salary in that half an hour, because there was something so extraordinary and desirable and contagious about that what you created in that half an hour, that was just breathtaking and sort of hard to get their heads around. And I think that's what kind of Paul's joke is about. They realized that this thing that they liked doing anyway, which was writing songs together, yeah, they could just earn huge amounts of money from half an hour's work, and then they could. I mean, that was crazy. And
Yeah.
we're a bit more used to that idea now, because we live in this kind of world of mass creativity, mass entertainment, and passive income, and all these kind of other concepts. But then it was pretty new.
On this songwriting and song release strategy, one thing that strikes me about the Beatles is both their albums and their non-album singles, which seems like kind of a unique thing that, well, one, most albums would usually have a few good songs and then a bunch of filler. A few good songs if you're lucky, right? There's kind of some filler, but the Beatles albums,
Mm.
especially Rubber Soul onward, didn't really have filler. There was no room for filler. There weren't covers the same way there were on the early albums. And then on top of this, on top of multiple albums a year of just great music, they'd also release these non-album singles. And some of their best known songs like Paperback Writer, Rain, Lady Madonna, Hey Jude, Revolution, they were never on an album, or they weren't packaged on an album. You'd buy them as a single. And what was their strategy behind this? Is it just that they wrote so much good music they couldn't even fit it all in the albums, that they were just overflowing with great hits? Or was there more of a deliberate approach to doing this both album and non-album single approach?
Yeah, and it goes back. I can't remember if Please Please Me is on Please Please Me. It's the kind of thing I should know, but I forget. But certainly She Loves You and I Wanna Hold Your Hand, I don't think are on albums. And yeah, you see that all the way through. Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, probably the most famous example, recorded for Sergeant Pepper and then kind of, no, we'll release these as a single. And obviously it's a
Yeah.
single.
By the way, you're in England and you know the UK albums. I know the American albums, and so some of these I think would be on albums for the ones that I purchased as
Right,
well, but
right.
they weren't on the UK albums. Yeah.
You don't look old enough to have purchased the
Well,
American
I
versions.
didn't purchase them back then, but even at like I'd go to like my local Best Buy and buy the CD of it, right, or
Oh,
something like
right.
that. I
Uh,
wasn't, yeah, or maybe even on streaming. Like when I look at the U.S. albums, which I probably default to on my Spotify or YouTube Music or whatever, it always has those singles on an album. I think like Penny Lane is on Magical Mystery Tour, I want to say.
they did put them on Magical Mystery Tour, that's fine. But they were recorded for
Yeah.
Sergeant Pepper,
Oh,
so they
that's right.
were
Okay.
they were meant to be part of that. You see, there's a kind of famous thing, which is like, "Oh my god, what if they had been on Sergeant Pepper? It would have been, like, even more amazing." But yeah, but generally, yeah, a lot of singles, a lot of their most famous songs are not on any albums, and their albums are really pretty good. So I don't think this was a normal thing. I think this was them from the beginning deciding that they didn't wanna rip fans off, and they wanted to kinda give fans more than fans expected. So, these days the cliche is, you surprise and delight your audience, but it was that kind of thing. It was like, how can we actually go further than we need to, in terms of, generosity and giving our audience more? And in a way, it become a bit of a rod for their own backs, I think, because once they'd established that kind of habit, they didn't feel like they could get rid of it. So I think they kind of maybe regretted not putting Strawberry Fields on Sergeant Pepper, et cetera, et cetera. But by that stage, they'd established the precedent. But yeah, I mean, I just think it's another beautiful example of the Beatles just always doing more than they needed to and being better than they needed to at every stage in every aspect of their creative production.
One of the other things that strikes me about them is their public relations. So much of the footage we see from them in the 60s is them in front of the press with a bunch of microphones in their face, especially in their touring years where they'd kind of sit and everybody from the city that they were touring in would have the local media asking them questions. And they were just so witty and have kind of like meta commentary about being interviewed in a way, or kind of there was a self-awareness to like how strange it all was. They just strike me as the folks who would do really well on social media today as well. So do you have
Yeah.
any thoughts on their approach to public relations and media relations and how it differed from other artists at the time?
It's funny as you're talking. It does remind me of these kind of current debates in politics about how to present how to get yourself across. And the contrast between the way the Democrats handled communications in the election campaign and the way the Republicans, or at least the way the kind of Trump wing of the Republicans do it, which is much more freewheeling and kind of here I am and unscripted and rambling on, versus the Democrats who are more conventional politicians. Like, here's the script, and I don't want a freewheeling conversation because I might say something wrong, right?
Right.
And the Beatles did have that kind of like, we're unafraid. We'll just come on and talk to you, and we'll answer any of your questions. It's fine. We might kind of take the piss out of you if you ask a stupid question, but we're not going to just do the scripted kind of delivery. And they hated that kind of artificial, synthetic kind of being a good boy kind of in front of the press and saying the right things. Just as a lot of people today hate the kind of conventional politician, just being on message all the time. The Beatles never
Mhm.
wanted to be on message. They always wanted to be themselves, and you see that in the press, in the PR as well as the music. Where does it come from? I mean, I think this again goes back to the fact that they spent a long time together. struggling to become famous for several years. And obviously John and Paul and George have been together for like 5, 6 years by the time they get famous. And they've been performing in all these terrible places. And they've just been kind of pushed together, and they've got this very strong sense of who they are. There's a very strong internal culture, organizational culture, if you like, which and so by the time they get famous and they're in front of the world's cameras, they just know exactly who they are, and they're not prepared to compromise on that. They're just like, well, this is who we are. We're you know we like making ourselves laugh, and we hope you're going to laugh along. And by and large, the world did.
On this topic, one of the things that seems appropriate to bring up is the "more popular than Jesus" quote, and this is also another area where a band is probably dealing with something that no other band has really dealt with before, of like a PR crisis about the importance of
Yeah.
religion and comparing themselves to that, and it seems relatively like a kind of a blip. Obviously, it's an important point if you see the documentary or in your book, it's covered, but it is something they also recovered from pretty well. How do you think they handled it, or what was sort of their approach to handling that?
Well, yes and no. It was a blip, but I think it was quite a kind of scary blip at the time, both because when they were on tour in the States and there was this whole kind of hoo-ha about Bigger Than Jesus, they felt under assault. They felt sort of unpopular for the first time, or they felt hostility, real hostility towards them for the first time, which was very unsettling. And they felt a physical threat as well. There have been
Yeah.
rumors of snipers getting into concerts. Maybe someone's going to shoot us. So that was all quite scary. And some of their concerts didn't sell out. That tour, there were empty seats in those stadiums, right? Which had kind of never
Yeah.
happened before. So I think it felt a little bit like this might be it. There was some sort of sense of real jeopardy there in terms of their career. But the way they get through it is by returning to this sense of inner conviction and determination to tell the truth as they saw it, without being kind of overly combative or rude. They say, "Look, it wasn't intended as a criticism of Christianity, and we weren't saying we're like Jesus or better than Jesus. We're just making observation about the way society's going, right?" What terrified them actually was not so, well, and certainly this is true of John, not so much the prospect of career ending, although obviously that was pretty bad. It was in a way something even worse, which was this sense that he would be forced to lie and to sort of not be himself, and that they would all kind of have to say, "Oh yes, we're terribly sorry. We do believe that Christianity is just as we'll always survive and be bigger." And I don't know whatever the lie would have been that would have satisfied these people, if there was anyone. I think that
Yeah.
sense of like we might have to compromise ourselves, and then they pretty quickly work out, no, we're not going to do that. If we stick together and we talk our way through this, and we're just confident we can just get through this, and even if it means hurting our commercial popularity, what's the big deal? I mean, they really had to kind of in negotiation terms, they had a BATNA, they had a kind of walk away thing, which was like, well, fine, we're just going to carry on making music and enjoying ourselves. And if this is it, we've already done way better than we thought we would do. So that gave them a kind of fearlessness.
In the 60s, late 60s, there's the rise of rock music criticism for the first time. It doesn't seem like rock music criticism was really much of a thing. And Rolling Stone magazine comes out, and John Lennon is the first person on the cover. Do you have any sense of how they approached rock criticism, or did it actually have any impact on sort of their commercial sales or anything? Or what are your reactions or thoughts on sort of rock criticism at this time?
It didn't, yeah, it didn't really have any impact. And as you say, it wasn't really. They sort of created like so much else. They sort of created the whole category of you know, grown-ups thinking and talking and writing about rock music, right?
Yeah.
Their music was way ahead of the category of or the sector of entertainment and music, and wasn't really ready for music of sophistication and depth and complexity. And so they were way out ahead of everyone for a long time, with a few peers like Bob Dylan and the Beach Boys and the Who. But the charts were mostly full of kind of quite quite bad sort of pop acts, really up until the mid '60s. So the finally starts to become this whole kind of like rock critic, yeah, kind of rock journalism. And then it does become quite important. It's never really important to them in terms of sales, I don't think. But not it particularly kind of starts to bite around the time that they're splitting up in the wake of the Beatles breakup when they're doing solo albums. The extent to which they really cared about what critics said about their albums is really kind of striking to me. Looking back on it now, it seems almost unbelievable because like McCartney's first solo albums sold really well, pretty well, but he was devastated by the bad reviews.
Yeah.
And it really, really hurt him, really got to him. So there was a sense that there was this kind of like, how am I seen by critics, by my peers? That's really important to me, as well as whether or not people are buying my records. But I think that kind of happens towards the end of the 60s, early 70s. And really, the kind of early 70s, or through the 70s for a few years, is the heyday of the really, really powerful rock critic establishment.
That's right. So I was reading some of the contemporary reviews of Paul's solo work, and I think like I had brought up Venus and Mars in the Rolling Stone review at the time of Venus Mars, and the opening lines are something to the effect of like, "Gosh, you're really seeing how important John Lennon was," and there's really missing the presence of John Lennon, and it's a Paul review, but the first person mentioned in the review is John Lennon, and it seems like there was this image of John as the tortured artist and the brilliant mind behind the group. And Venus and Mars, an album I think that's aged pretty well overall. I think a review today would be different about its assessment of it. I think also like Lester Bangs was like a popular critic at the time, or called Paul Muzak, and very, very dismissive of it. And like they could really be mean about it. So it seems like it's something that if they're artists, like how could you not be impacted by that some way if something's could be so vicious about your music?
Yeah, and they were very much of their time in that they were mostly male. They responded to Lennon's kind of strong kind of, what we might still call kind of like high agency vibe, and his kind of countercultural and who's making big kind of political gestures around this time in the early 70s. He's part of the kind of anti-Vietnam, anti-Nixon movement. He was on the right side of history in inverted commas, right?
Yeah.
And he was very much part of the kind of countercultural move, which was really where all the kind of like hip people were, right? And McCartney was not really there. I mean, in a sense, he was political. There were certain things that he cared about and campaigned on, like marijuana legalization and vegetarianism, and you arguably had a much greater impact on those causes over time than Lennon did in sort of dabbling with counterculture for a couple of years. So it wasn't that he was apolitical, and he did make a song about Northern Ireland as well. But it's that he didn't see himself as an essentially political figure in the same way. And he was also just somebody who was unashamedly into being a dad and a loving husband, and that was totally uncool. It didn't really fit with the kind of prevailing ideas of being a rock star and being a man, being an artistic man and being a genius. You were meant to be conflicted and difficult and weird and messed up and do unconventional things and throw TVs out of windows and take drugs and maybe be really horrible to women. That's kind of part of it as well. And
Yeah.
McCartney was just sort of refusing to do any of that stuff. So he really, his reputation took a battering in the 70s, and it got much worse after John's death, because John then becomes kind of deified, and it takes many years for his reputation to recover from that.
One other note I think that's worth highlighting for the marketing element of the Beatles is Apple Corps. And they named their company Apple Corps, and we were talking about naming earlier, and you cited Apple as a great computer brand. And it just strikes me that what do they name their company? Apple Corps. And that even though the company wasn't especially successful, that name actually became pretty valuable because of the trademark and licensing and legal settlements with Apple Computer, which they could have never known at the start. But they picked this really great name, and it seems like that seemed to be among one of the more valuable parts of that company itself. And it seems like it was reflective of some smart branding intuition. Do you have any any thoughts on Apple core?
Well, it was Paul McCartney's name, and he took it from, I think from a René Magritte painting. McCartney is a huge fan of René Magritte. He just got into him at the time, and there's that famous picture of the man with an apple in front of his
Mhm.
face, and I think he took it from that, and he just liked the sense of artistic kind of subversion and surrealism that it was associated with, and just sort of they very much kind of were running on the instinct during the whole Apple thing. In business terms, that proved to be disastrous because it turns out your artistic instincts aren't that good when it comes to running a business. But anything to do with the creative side of it, they were still pretty good. And yeah, Apple is a great name.
Yeah, thanks for this conversation, this tour of Beatles history. I know that we kind of took the marketing and business approach to this book, but it's this book is so much more than just that. In fact, this business element is just kind of a footnote in the book, and at the core is just this amazing, heartfelt, intimate story of these two geniuses who we were lucky enough that they crossed paths as young men and made all the contributions they made. But as you sort of reflect on this conversation and of any reflections on lessons that marketers can draw from the Beatles or other things we didn't talk about when it comes to the Beatles and some of the innovation they did around sort of marketing and branding and promoting their music and their work.
I mean, I think there are more. I think is like the more you think about it, the more kind of stuff comes up. One of the things I was thinking about the other day was the analogy of George Martin and Eric Schmidt at Google. When you have a startup and you have these like brilliant young guys, and then it's like, well, like, you might need a kind of gray hair, experienced guy. And Eric Schmidt was the perfect guy for the Google co-founders, and he kind of helped. But in other cases, it hasn't worked out because the gray hair thinks he knows better than these kids and tries to impose his kind of like experience on them, and it doesn't work. George Martin was in that Eric Schmidt mode. Like he used his experience, but he recognized very early on that they were the talent and that they really knew what they were doing, even if they weren't musically educated like he was. They had great musical sophistication and great musical intuition. So his ability to kind of put his ego to one side and say, well, how can I help these guys rather than trying to impose my ideas on them? I think is a great lesson there for startups and growth. But yeah, I'm sure we could talk for a lot longer.
Yeah.
There's so many lessons.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, thanks so much for the conversation. I just, as a one final question, where can listeners find you online?
Well, I think the easiest place to get me is my newsletter, my Substack newsletter, which is called The Ruffian. So if you just Google my name and Substack or The Ruffian, you'll find your way to it.
Yes, I'm a subscriber to The Ruffian. I love it. It's a really great newsletter that had a lot on John and Paul and also a lot of other great topics. Ian, Leslie, thanks so much for joining me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Thanks a lot, Andrew.
A History of Marketing is written and produced by me, Andrew Mittrack. If you'd like new episodes delivered right to your inbox, visit marketinghistory.org. There you can also find transcripts of every conversation, including helpful links, images, videos, and other blog posts about marketing history. You can send me an email at hello@marketinghistory.org. If you'd like to support A History of Marketing, consider leaving a review on your favorite podcasting app, or better yet, tell a friend about the show. Thanks for listening.